Part 1. The Day That Changed Everything. On August 31st, 2001, the quiet town of Puello, in the state of Washington, was shaken by an event that would never be forgotten. Laskowski, a 36-year-old woman, mother of triplets, and known for her dedication to her work, failed to show up for her babysitting shift that morning. Always punctual and responsible, her absence immediately caused concern among her employers, who tried in vain to contact her for several hours. With no alternative, they decided to call the police. Officers arrived at Dina's house around noon. As they approached, they noticed the front door was slightly ajar. After calling out and getting no response, the officers decided to enter and investigate. Inside, they found a scene straight out of a horror movie. The interior of the house was completely ransacked. Open drawers, scattered objects, and signs of a struggle suggested a robbery that had gone horribly wrong. However, as they moved into the living room, the officers stumbled upon something even more disturbing: the body of a woman matching Dina's description, lying on the sofa in a position that made it clear her death was anything but natural. The victim was lying face down, with a pillow and blanket covering her head. One arm was awkwardly bent behind her back while the other seemed trapped beneath her body. Strangulation marks on her neck and abrasions on her knees and elbows indicated she had been dragged across the floor. Upon closer examination, investigators noticed her mouth was filled with blood, underscoring the brutality of the attack. Forensic experts were immediately called and spent hours collecting evidence. Samples of hair, fibers, and fingerprints were gathered from various parts of the house. In the basement, a broken window suggested the intruder might have entered through there. Still, investigators did not rule out the possibility that the scene had been staged to cover up a premeditated crime. As Dina's body was removed from the residence, neighbors began to gather on the street. The sight of multiple patrol cars and officers working in such a quiet neighborhood was almost surreal. Many watched in shock, while others whispered about how something so terrible could have happened to someone so beloved. That same day, the body was subjected to an autopsy, which revealed even more shocking details. Dina had been manually strangled, resulting in the crushing of her trachea. There were also signs of a struggle. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms indicated that she had tried to fight back, but her attacker was clearly stronger. The autopsy further revealed that her death had been caused by a rear naked choke, a technique that compresses the neck, cutting off blood and oxygen circulation. Although the attack had been extremely violent, there was no indication of sexual motivation. Dina was fully clothed, and the examination found no evidence pointing to such a crime. This detail raised questions about what could have driven someone to commit such a brutal act. Dina's employers, the first to suspect something was wrong, were informed of the tragedy. Devastated, they provided the little information they had to the police, including details about Dina's relatives. The only close contact known to them was Amanda Ross, a troubled 17-year-old niece who often stayed overnight at her aunt's house. The police decided to look for Amanda, believing she might help piece together the events of the previous night. However, locating her would prove more difficult than expected. Amanda led an unstable life, marked by drug use and a transient lifestyle. With limited technological resources available in 2001, finding Amanda quickly became a major challenge for investigators. Part 2. The Search for Amanda. With Amanda Ross's disappearance becoming a central focus of the investigation, the police intensified their efforts to locate her. Dina's niece was known for her erratic behavior and her tendency to associate with questionable individuals. She had dropped out of school during her senior year and spent much of her time at parties or staying with friends, often in neighborhoods the police considered high risk. Investigators began by questioning Dina's neighbors, hoping to uncover any information about Amanda's whereabouts. Many reported seeing her frequently coming and going from her aunt's house, but none could recall spotting her in the days leading up to the crime. However, one neighbor mentioned hearing muffled screams the night before Dina's body was discovered, but dismissed it as a typical domestic dispute. Meanwhile, forensic analysis began to provide valuable clues. Fingerprints found at the crime scene matched Amanda's, indicating she had been in Dina's house shortly before or during the crime. Additionally, muddy footprints near the broken basement window matched the size and pattern of shoes Amanda was known to wear. This strengthened suspicions that the young woman had been directly involved. The investigation also uncovered a series of handwritten notes Amanda had left in a small diary found in the guest room of Dina's house. Some entries revealed a troubled relationship between the two. In one passage, Amanda complained about how Dina tried to control her life and had a habit of thinking she always knew best. In another, she mentioned arguments over money and accused her aunt of being overly strict. As police worked to locate Amanda, a crucial tip came from an anonymous informant. According to the tip, Amanda had been spotted at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town the morning of the crime. The witness described her as disoriented and with visible scratches on her arms, details that immediately caught the investigators' attention. Using this lead, the police launched an operation to search motels and boarding houses in the area. At one such location, they found Amanda, who had checked in under a false name. When approached, she attempted to flee but was quickly apprehended. She appeared to be in shock and showed clear signs of recent drug use. At the police station, Amanda was interrogated, but her account of the events was muddled and inconsistent. She denied involvement in the crime, claiming she had been at a friend's house the night Dina was murdered. However, the physical evidence pointed directly to her, and her attempt to flee only heightened police suspicions. While Amanda remained in custody, a new element emerged in the investigation. A toxicology report revealed the presence of methamphetamine in her bloodstream, explaining her erratic behavior. Investigators believe that her drug use might have influenced her actions on the night of the crime. Faced with mounting evidence, Amanda began to admit parts of the story. She confessed to being at Dina's house the night before the crime, but claimed she had no intention of harming her. According to Amanda, the argument started when she asked her aunt for money, and Dina refused, accusing her of wasting everything on drugs. The fight allegedly escalated to the point where Amanda lost control. Despite this partial confession, investigators doubted Amanda was telling the full truth. The extreme violence of the crime suggested premeditation or the involvement of another person, but Amanda insisted she acted alone and that it had all been an accident. Part 3: Contradictions and New Discoveries. Although Amanda Ross had admitted to partial involvement in the case, her inconsistencies during interrogation kept investigators on edge. She maintained that her aunt's death had been accidental, but specific details didn't align with the evidence found at the crime scene. For instance, Amanda claimed the argument with Dina started in the living room, and in the heat of the moment she pushed her aunt, causing her to hit her head on the floor. However, the autopsy revealed that Dina had died from strangulation, with clear manual pressure marks on her neck and signs of a violent struggle. Furthermore, the presence of blood in various parts of the house indicated that the attack had been prolonged and brutal, something that did not match Amanda's version of events. Investigators also questioned her claim of being alone on the night of the crime. Text messages retrieved from Amanda's phone, found at the motel where she was arrested, suggested she had met with a friend named Ryan Clark just hours before the murder. Ryan was known for his criminal record, which included petty theft and drug dealing, raising the possibility of his involvement in the case. When confronted with these messages, Amanda became visibly uneasy. At first, she denied Ryan's connection to the crime, but under pressure from investigators, she admitted he had accompanied her to Dina's house that night. According to Amanda, it was Ryan who suggested breaking into the house through the basement window after Dina refused to open the door. Amanda claimed that Ryan was there just to support her, in case things got out of hand, but investigators began to suspect he had played a more active role in the crime. Further investigation revealed that a footprint near the broken basement window did not match Amanda's shoe size but was consistent with that of an adult male. With this new information, police tracked down Ryan Clark to an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. When apprehended, Ryan resisted arrest and was armed, but officers managed to subdue him without serious incident. During his interrogation, Ryan initially denied any involvement in the murder, claiming he was elsewhere on the night of the crime. However, Evidence found in his possession contradicted his story. Blood-stained clothing, later confirmed to belong to Dina, was discovered in his backpack. Additionally, Ryan was carrying jewelry identified as belonging to the victim, further strengthening the case against him. When confronted with this evidence, Ryan changed his account. He claimed that Amanda had been solely responsible for the murder, and that he was just trying to help protect her. According to Ryan, Amanda became enraged after Dina refused to lend her money and she lost control, attacking her aunt violently. He insisted he tried to intervene, but that Amanda had already strangled Dina by the time he could stop her. Despite Ryan's claims, investigators believed he was downplaying his role in the crime. The severity of the attack, combined with the presence of two suspects at the scene, suggested the murder might have been premeditated or at least the result of a joint effort. As charges were being formalized against Amanda and Ryan, forensic analysis continued to uncover critical details. DNA samples taken from under Dina's nails matched Ryan's, indicating he had come into direct contact with the victim during the struggle. This finding reinforced the theory that both suspects had actively participated in the murder. As the evidence mounted, Amanda and Ryan began blaming each other, each attempting to minimize their own responsibility. Amanda claimed Ryan had initiated the attack and that she had gone along with it. Meanwhile, Ryan insisted Amanda was the mastermind behind the crime and that he had been a reluctant bystander. As the case unfolded, prosecutors began building their charges based on the physical evidence and the suspects' contradictory statements. It became increasingly clear that Dina's death was not an isolated accident, but the result of a complex chain of events fueled by anger, drugs, and desperation. Part 4: What really happened? As the investigation progressed, prosecutors began piecing together a clearer and more disturbing picture of the night Dina Ross lost her life. Based on forensic evidence, messages exchanged before the crime, and the contradictory statements of Amanda and Ryan, it became evident that the murder was not merely a moment of emotional outburst, but a deliberate act driven by anger, desperation, and the destructive influence of drugs. On the night of the crime, Amanda and Ryan arrived at Dina's house around 10 p.m. Amanda, desperate for money to pay off a debt to Ryan, was under immense pressure. Ryan had threatened her if she didn't pay, and Amanda saw her aunt as her last resort. Initially, Amanda approached the front door, but Dina, tired of dealing with her niece's erratic behavior, refused to let her in. The two began arguing through the window. Amanda pleaded for financial help, but Dina firmly declined, believing that giving her money would only fuel her addiction. The tension escalated. Ryan, who had remained silent up to that point, suggested breaking into the house through the basement. He knew there was an easily accessible window and showed no hesitation, indicating the crime was far from a spur-of-the-moment decision. The two forced their way in, breaking the window and creating an entry point into the house. This was their first fatal mistake, as the poorly staged burglary would later be easily debunked by forensic experts. Once inside, the argument between Amanda and Dina quickly turned physical. Amanda, emotionally unstable and under the influence of drugs, began yelling at Dina, blaming her for her problems. Dina, trying to reason with her, urged Amanda to seek help and change her life. However, her words only fueled Amanda's anger, pushing her closer to the edge. The verbal conflict turned into a violent altercation. Amanda attacked Dina, shoving her into the living room furniture. Dina fought back, leaving scratches on Amanda's arms and, later, on Ryan's as well. Ryan, who initially seemed like a passive observer, decided to intervene. Forensic evidence indicated that he used significant force during the attack, as the strangulation marks on Dina's neck showed intense manual pressure, likely beyond Amanda's physical capability alone. The struggle was long and violent. Dina tried to defend herself, but the combined strength of Ryan and Amanda proved overwhelming. By the time Dina was subdued, the two realized they had crossed a point of no return. Investigators concluded that Dina's injuries reflected a prolonged attack, pointing to a deliberate and cruel act rather than an accident. After the murder, Amanda and Ryan faced the challenge of covering their tracks. In a desperate attempt to stage a robbery, They ransacked drawers, scattered objects around the house, and tried to create the appearance of a botched burglary. Ryan broke the basement window to suggest a break-in, but their efforts lacked the logic of a real robbery. No significant valuables were taken, and their actions were inconsistent and sloppy. Before fleeing, Amanda and Ryan stole small pieces of jewelry and an emergency cash stash that Dina kept in the house. These items were later found in Ryan's possession, further incriminating him. After the crime, Amanda, emotionally shaken, checked into a cheap motel in town, where she was found days later. Ryan, on the other hand, used part of the stolen money to buy drugs, demonstrating where his priorities lay even after the horrific act. The findings revealed that Dina's murder was the result of a combination of factors: the accumulated tension between aunt and niece, Ryan's coercion, and the influence of drugs created a perfect storm of violence that ended not only Dina's life, but also destroyed Amanda's and Ryan's. The brutality of the crime shocked not only the quiet community of Puello, but also the investigators working on the case, making it clear that what happened that night was not a momentary lapse in judgment, but the outcome of deliberate and fatal choices. Part 5. The Trial of Amanda and Ryan. The trial of Amanda Ross and Ryan Clark began in April 2002 and quickly captured the attention of both local and national media. The story of a young niece and her accomplice, involved in the brutal murder of a loving aunt, seemed to have emerged straight from a nightmare. As the prosecution prepared to present its case against the defendants, the courtroom was packed daily with friends, family, and onlookers eager to follow every detail. Amanda, sitting in the defendant's chair, appeared worn down and vulnerable. She often avoided making eye contact with the jury and rarely glanced toward Dina's family, who sat visibly emotional on the other side of the courtroom. Ryan, however, maintained a cold and arrogant demeanor, as if unfazed by the gravity of the charges. The prosecution painted both as active participants in a brutal, premeditated crime, emphasizing the extreme violence inflicted on the victim. The prosecution meticulously reconstructed the timeline of events. Using physical evidence, testimony, from forensic experts and text messages retrieved from Amanda's and Ryan's phones, they presented a solid case against the two. Fingerprints found at the scene, footprints near the basement window, and Ryan's DNA under Dina's fingernails were critical pieces of evidence proving their direct involvement in the attack. The text messages exchanged between Amanda and Ryan before the crime were especially damning. In one message, Amanda mentioned the need to get money no matter how, while Ryan responded with suggestions on how to force entry into Dina's home. These messages were crucial in showing that the crime was not impulsive, but rather the result of deliberate planning. Testimony from forensic experts further strengthened the prosecution's argument. Specialists detailed the strangulation marks on Dina's neck, explaining how the force used was enough to fracture her trachea, requiring significant physical strength. Combined with the scratches on Ryan's arms, this evidence indicated that he played an active role in the fatal assault. Additionally, defensive wounds on Dina's hands and arms showed that she fought desperately for her life. Amanda's defense team sought to craft a narrative that would evoke sympathy from the jury. Her attorneys argued that she was an emotionally unstable young woman, influenced by drugs and manipulated by Ryan. They claimed Amanda had no intention of killing Dina, and that the crime was the result of an impulsive outburst of anger. However, the prosecution countered this argument by pointing out the brutality of the attack and the attempts to cover up the crime, which contradicted the notion of an impulsive act. Ryan, on the other hand, tried to distance himself from the crime entirely. During his testimony, he claimed he was merely accompanying Amanda and had not participated in the attack. He placed all the blame on Amanda, portraying her as unstable and violent. However, under cross-examination, Ryan contradicted himself multiple times. His explanation for the jewelry belonging to Dina found in his possession failed to convince the jury, and the prosecution highlighted the presence of his fingerprints in critical areas of the crime scene. The final moments of the trial were marked by intense emotion. The prosecution demanded the harshest sentences possible for Amanda and Ryan, arguing that the crime was cruel, premeditated, and had destroyed not only Dina's life but also her family and community. The defense appealed for leniency, particularly for Amanda, claiming she was a victim of circumstance and Ryan's influence. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Amanda and Ryan were found guilty of first-degree murder. Amanda was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, while Ryan received the same sentence along with additional time for obstruction and resisting arrest. The impact of the trial was profound. For Dina's family, the convictions brought some sense of justice, though the pain of their loss was irreparable. Many friends and neighbors of the victim expressed relief that those responsible were held accountable. But the case left lasting scars on the Puello community, which was never the same again. As Amanda faced her new reality in prison, her story became a cautionary tale about how poor choices, combined with addiction and toxic relationships, can lead to devastating consequences. Ryan, on the other hand, continued to deny his role in the crime, but it was clear to all that he had played a central part in the tragic outcome. Part 6. Consequences and Reflections. Following the conviction of Amanda Ross and Ryan Clark, the small town of Puello entered a period of mourning and reflection. The case not only exposed the fragility of family relationships, but also highlighted the dangers of substance abuse, negative influences, and the emotional breakdown that led to the tragic outcome. Dina Laskowski, once known as a dedicated and altruistic woman, became a local symbol of generosity cut short by brutality. Friends and neighbors remembered her as someone always willing to help, especially in times of difficulty. At her funeral, dozens gathered to pay their final respects, sharing stories that celebrated Dina's kindness and resilience in the face of adversity. Meanwhile, Amanda and Ryan began serving their sentences in maximum security prisons in Washington state. Amanda, who initially seemed resigned to her fate, began to show signs of remorse. In letters written from prison and sent to relatives, she attempted to express regret for her actions. Though many doubted her sincerity, some family members, including Dina's children, refused to read the letters, asserting that no apology could make up for what had been taken from them. Ryan, on the other hand, maintained his stance of denial. In interviews with local newspapers, he continued to blame Amanda for everything, claiming he had been dragged into the crime without intending to participate. This self-victimizing attitude made him an even more despised figure among Puello's residents, who saw his statements as an attempt to avoid accountability. The case's repercussions were felt in the judicial system and the local community. The trial brought attention to the impact of drug addiction on domestic violence and the lack of adequate support systems, which can push individuals into extreme situations. In response, community groups began organizing awareness campaigns on substance abuse and the importance of identifying signs of toxic family dynamics before they escalated into tragedies. For the prosecutors and police officers involved in the case, the work was as exhausting as it was impactful. Many admitted that the crime's brutality and the surrounding circumstances left a lasting emotional mark. The police chief at the time described the case in an interview as one of the hardest of his career, not only because of the investigation's complexity, but also because of the evident pain felt by everyone connected to the victim. The story also sparked broader debates about society's role in offering second chances. Amanda, described by her defense as a victim of the system and her circumstances, became an example of how the lack of early intervention can lead to devastating consequences. However, many believed Amanda's choices, while influenced by external factors, were her responsibility, and that the punishment she received was just. Despite her life sentence, Amanda began participating in rehabilitation programs within the prison system. On occasion, she agreed to share her story with counselors and other inmates in an effort to warn young people about the dangers of drugs and poor decisions. For many, however, these gestures seemed insufficient given the gravity of her actions. Ryan, in contrast, refused to take part in any rehabilitation initiatives. He remained isolated, avoiding contact with support groups or educational programs. His prison records showed a pattern of rebellious behavior, with repeated disciplinary actions for insubordination. This attitude only reinforced his image as someone incapable of taking responsibility for his actions. As the years passed, the community of Puello struggled to move past the case's impact. Some residents sought ways to channel their pain into positive action. Support groups for families of violent crime victims emerged, providing a space for people to share their stories and find solace. For those closest to Dina, however, time seemed unable to heal the loss. Her children, now adults, faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives without the maternal figure who had guided them for so many years. Many described the experience as carrying an invisible scar, a permanent mark of something that could never be fully mended. The case of Amanda and Ryan, though resolved in court, continued to be recounted as a grim lesson about the dangers of hatred, negative influence, and poor choices. It became a cautionary tale of how relationships meant to be built on trust and love can spiral into tragedy when boundaries are crossed and second chances are overlooked. Part 7. The story that won't be forgotten. Though Amanda and Ryan were behind bars, the crime committed against Dina Laskowski continued to reverberate throughout Puello and beyond. The case gained national notoriety, drawing the attention of television programs and documentaries that delved into the macabre details of the murder and the social factors that contributed to the tragedy. For many, Dina's story was more than a violent crime. It was a poignant example of how family bonds could deteriorate to the point of breaking. Amanda's narrative, a young woman with potential derailed by poor choices and destructive influences, raised pressing questions about how similar situations might be prevented in the future. As the town grappled with its grief, the people of Puello sought to turn Dina's memory into something meaningful. Friends and neighbors came together to establish a community center in her honor. Named the Laskowski House, it was designed to support vulnerable youth and families in crisis. The center offered educational programs, psychological counseling, and substance abuse recovery resources, aiming to ensure that other lives would not follow the tragic path of Amanda's. Inside prison, Amanda struggled with the weight of her actions. She began keeping a journal in which she reflected on her life and the decisions that led her to participate in such a brutal crime. In an excerpt shared with the media, Amanda wrote, "My aunt always tried to help me, but I couldn't see it. Anger and despair blinded me. There's no excuse for what I did. I destroyed her life and my own." While these words suggested some level of remorse, they were not enough for many, particularly Dina's children. They steadfastly refused any contact with Amanda, maintaining that nothing could undo the pain she had caused. For them, the community center honoring their mother's memory was the only way to find a semblance of peace, by turning her legacy into something positive. Ryan, in contrast, remained firmly in denial. During an interview from prison, he claimed he never intended to harm anyone and that he had been wrongly convicted. He blamed Amanda entirely, portraying her as a manipulative person who dragged him into a situation beyond his control. These statements were widely criticized, both by the Puello community and by experts who had followed the case. While Amanda and Ryan followed divergent paths within the prison system, Dina's story became a case study in universities and seminars on psychology and criminology. Professors used it to discuss themes such as dysfunctional family dynamics, substance abuse, and the critical importance of early intervention. The case also spurred practical changes. Police officers and social workers in Puello began receiving specialized training to handle domestic abuse and substance dependency cases. These efforts, while incapable of undoing the past, were aimed at preventing future tragedies. Over time, Amanda began to engage in educational programs within the prison. She earned her high school diploma and started studying psychology in an effort to understand the behavioral patterns that had led to her actions. Eventually, she became an informal counselor for other inmates, helping them confront their own traumas and poor decisions. Despite these attempts at redemption, Amanda was acutely aware that forgiveness would not come from many. In a letter sent to a journalist, she admitted, "I know I can never make up for what I've done. My punishment isn't just being here, it's knowing that I destroyed something that can never be rebuilt." For the Puello community, Dina Laskowski's case remained a painful memory but also a stark warning. It highlighted how tragedies often stem from deep-rooted issues, years of neglect, unresolved pain, and misguided choices. And while the scars of the crime would never fully fade, the community center and the preventive efforts established in Dana's name symbolized the hope that something meaningful could emerge from the ashes of tragedy. Part 8. Lessons from a Brutal Crime. Years passed, but the story of Dina Laskowski, Amanda Ross, and Ryan Clark was never forgotten. The brutality of the crime, the troubled relationship between aunt and niece, and the destructive influence of drugs made this case one of the most memorable in the history of the small town of Pueblo. Inside prison, Amanda Ross continued trying to deal with the consequences of her actions. Although she had participated in educational programs and sought ways to redeem herself, she knew she could never undo what she had done. Her letters of remorse were never answered by Dina's family, and the few friends left from her past life avoided any contact. To many, it didn't matter how many times Amanda said she was sorry. The fact remained that she took the life of someone who had tried to help her until the very end. Ryan Clark, on the other hand, remained unyielding. He never admitted his guilt and spent the following years in prison accumulating disciplinary infractions. His refusal to take responsibility for the crime made him one of the most hated inmates in the prison, both by the officers and other prisoners. To those who followed the case, Ryan represented everything worst about that crime: coldness, violence, and a complete lack of remorse. Meanwhile, Dina Laskowski's memory was preserved not only through the community center established in her honor, but also through the stories told by those who knew her. Her children grew up determined to honor her legacy, turning their pain into motivation to help other families facing similar hardships. The town of Pueblo also changed. The shocking case made many people more aware of the signs of abuse and drug addiction around them. Social programs were strengthened, rehabilitation efforts received more support, and awareness about the dangers of toxic relationships and substance abuse grew significantly. Could the crime that destroyed Dina Laskowski's life have been prevented? That's a question many still ask. If Amanda had received help before her life spiraled out of control, if Ryan hadn't encouraged the break-in that night, if Dina had been more cautious, perhaps the outcome would have been different. But the reality is that the past cannot be changed, only remembered so that similar mistakes are not repeated. Stories like this make us reflect on how far hatred, negligence, and the lack of boundaries can go. How did a simple request for money turn into an irreversible tragedy? How did family relationships, which should be built on love and support, become the setting for brutal violence? These are difficult but necessary questions. And now, we want to hear from you. What do you think about this case? Did Amanda truly regret her actions, or was she just trying to ease her guilt? Was Ryan the real manipulator, or was Amanda fully responsible for her choices? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoy real-life stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next cases. Your participation is essential for us to continue bringing impactful stories like this one. Thank you for watching. See you next time.